This meeting is being recorded.
It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Emily Wells. She is the Conservation Program Manager for Conservation Farms and Ranches with the Nature Conservancy. She manages the Staten Island Conservation Program and first started working there as, oops, let me take this off my screen. She started working there as a temporary avian technician in 2013 and left to pursue her master's degree in range and wildlife management at Texas A&M Kingsville, where she studied the wintering ecology of the Gulf Coast subpopulation of Sandhill Cranes. Once her studies were complete, she came back to Staten, where she helps coordinate the farming and conservation land management, conducts research into waterbird use of different crops and management techniques, and helps manage projects aimed at improving the conservation value and resiliency of Staten Island into the future. So it's a great pleasure. Emily, welcome. Over to you.
All right, thank you. That was a very thorough introduction, and I will definitely be repeating some of that throughout my slides. Yeah, happy to be here. Let me share my screen real quick. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful photo.
Yeah, so the photos from Staten Island, we are down here in the Delta. But so today I'll just be giving kind of an overview of cranes and then talking about kind of research down here within the wintering grounds and some general conservation needs moving forward.
Also, let me remind people that Emily and I, before everybody came on, decided that to hold your questions till the end of her presentation, and you can, I have chat open so you can put your questions in chat.
So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Sandhill Cranes, but they breed throughout North America and range all the way from Eastern Siberia through Alaska, Canada, and down into the US. So they breed right around where you guys are at, and even have started nesting in some of the Sierra and wet meadows, especially down here by Lake Tahoe. So they've definitely been expanding into newer areas, which has been pretty exciting. From the breeding grounds, they migrate south to their wintering grounds, which range all the way from the Sacramento Valley and the rest of the Central Valley, all the way through kind of the lower US and then down through most of Mexico. Within their range, cranes are broken up into 9 different populations with differences or populations based on differences in breeding grounds as well as wintering grounds. Of the 9 different populations, 3 are non-migratory. So the Florida sandhill crane, Cuban sandhill crane, and Mississippi sandhill cranes all breed and winter within their same areas. They're also their own subspecies, and all of them are endangered or state threatened. So they are definitely some populations that have not recovered well since they were protected back when hunting was started regulation. Of the 6 other migratory, or of the 6 migratory populations, we actually have 3 that overwinter within California. We've got the Pacific Coast population that breeds up in Alaska and then overwinters in the Central Valley, mostly on the southern end of the Central Valley. And then we've got the Central Valley population that breeds up near you guys into Oregon, as well as in British Columbia. And those birds also overwinter in the Sacramento Valley, so they've got really short migrations. And they're very big, greater Sandhill cranes. They're very fun to watch. So I mentioned a little bit that hunting has definitely been a pressure since hunting started. And a lot of the populations are still recovering within North America, but some of the populations have recovered enough that they have active hunting seasons. The central or the mid-continent population, which breeds throughout most of Canada and overwinters in Texas, New Mexico, and throughout most of Mexico, that population has recovered drastically since regulations were put in place. And so hunting can be a great tool to help manage these populations, but it's not a tool for every population. So here in California, to give a little bit of perspective, we have about 50,000 cranes within California in the wintertime, but the mid-continent population was recently estimated to be over 1 million individuals. So completely different scales. And when you go out to the Nebraska, if you ever get a chance, it's a fantastic experience to watch them migrate through along the Platte River and just see hundreds of thousands of cranes at one time. It's a pretty spectacular view. So definitely the different populations have different management goals. And so I'll delve into that a little bit later. Within the migratory populations, there's 3 different subspecies. We've got the lesser Sandhill crane, the Canadian Sandhill crane, and the greater Sandhill crane. The Canadian Sandhill crane sometimes gets grouped in with graders. Genetically, they are pretty similar to graders, and it's often hard to distinguish them. Morphologically, they are intermediate between the lesser and greater. So lessers are about 3.5 feet tall. So they're the shortest of the 3 subspecies, and they've got much smaller, shorter bills. Graders have much larger bills. They can get up to about 4.5 feet tall, so they're much taller. Canadian Sandhill cranes are right in the middle, so it's really hard to distinguish them from the other 2 subspecies. If you both or all 3 subspecies are the same colors, they've got the bright red cap, really gray colored feathers. And if you see any orange coloring on them, it could be the adults like to paint themselves during the breeding season, so they cover their feathers with mud. Also, juveniles, as they're approaching adulthood, they'll start looking more and more like adults, but some of the last things to change is the red crown. So even during spring migration, sometimes you'll see some of those youngest juveniles still with like a kind of grayish, slightly red tinged crown as they're still trying to grow into their colors. Another good way to determine juveniles from adults is their calls. So even through midwinter and into spring, you can tell the hatchier birds from adults because they may still have their little juvenile calls. It's this little chirping kind of whistling noise, very distinguishable from the adults, and it's absolutely adorable. Here's a picture of a lesser in the foreground and a greater behind it. So similar colors, same red crown, but even with the greater behind it, you can tell it's much larger than the bird in the foreground. Habitat-wise, there's definitely differences in what they use between breeding grounds and on the wintering grounds and during migration. So on the breeding grounds, there's also differences between the breeding adults and the non-breeders. Cranes are delayed breeders, so they may not start trying to nest and forming pair bonds until they could be 5 or 6 years old, which is one of the reasons why they were so prone to overharvest, is that it can take a long time for juveniles to learn how to mate and then actually successfully raise chicks. And so on the breeding grounds, when we're trying to think about conservation of these breeding habitats, we got to think about cranes that like to set up territories and defend them. They like to nest in shallow emergent wetlands and wet meadows, anywhere that there's some vegetation to actually build the platform nest, and then also for concealment. The nest is typically in wetlands in close proximity to foraging habitat, so that once the colts or the baby cranes hatch, they can actually walk to their foraging grounds. So having that connectivity between those two habitat types is really important, and will definitely help determine where cranes are across the landscape. During the breeding season, the kind of bachelor cranes that haven't paired off yet will stay together in small flocks, just feeding and roosting together throughout the summer. And as kind of summer progresses and fall comes around, breeding pairs and their colts will start rejoining these smaller flocks, and they'll start forming larger flocks, and they'll roost and forage communally for the rest of the season. So all the way, they'll keep building in flock size through fall migration and stay together throughout the winter. So being a communal foraging and roosting species definitely provides some protection on the wintering grounds from the different predators. Typically, crane habitat can really be broken down into two main categories: foraging habitat and roosting habitat. So like a lot of shorebirds, cranes don't have the extra toe to actually roost or sleep in a tree, so they can't stand on a branch. And so they will sleep out in large shallow water bodies, and they'll use a variety of different habitats, from flooded cropland, braided rivers like out in the Platte River, inland coastal bays and estuaries. So along the Texas coast, you've got a lot of really shallow intertidal areas, and you can actually see cranes roosting out in those natural spaces, which is pretty unique. Saline pluvial lakes are also really common in like Arizona and New Mexico. And out here in California, mostly cranes are using flooded agriculture and managed wetlands. For foraging habitat, cranes use, once again, a good diversity of habitat. They love cropland and grasslands, pasture, wetlands. And when we're thinking about that connectivity between roosting and foraging habitat, roosting habitat is often more limiting on the landscape. So especially here in the West, where it's a lot more arid, we've lost a lot of wetlands, and so it's typically less abundant on the landscape, and we frequently have to think more about conserving those wetland areas versus foraging habitat, which is cranes are kind of generalists and will use a lot of areas. So even if we lose corn, they can start switching to rice, or if it starts raining and all the wetlands are flooded, they can start feeding in alfalfa. So they are pretty adjustable when it comes to foraging habitat. So kind of mentioned, Sandhill cranes do select for large shallow water bodies. Usable depths range from about 2 inches to 10 inches. And use will depend on what's in the landscape. So here in California, we do have more managed wetlands and cropland versus different availability in other areas. Cranes also prefer areas removed from human disturbance. So overhunt, even if cranes aren't being hunted, the hunting disturbance can really discourage use by cranes. Not that it can't be compatible. Here on Staten, where I manage, we do have hunting, and it can be a great way to kind of spread out geese that can take over a roost. So as long as it's in low density, cranes will roost around hunting. So not only did they avoid too much human disturbance, but they also try to select for those open areas where they can see predators more easily. You won't see a lot of cranes roosting right next to like in wooded wetlands or near forested edges, because it is a good spot for predators to hide. So foraging cranes will use a variety of crops. They love grain crops like corn, milo, sorghum, wheat, and rice. They also use a lot of non-grain crops. Alfalfa and potatoes are some really common ones. And cranes tend to avoid cotton fields, vineyards, orchards, and forests. So they really don't like to be inside canopies because it's really hard to take off, and it's a issue for predators and getting depredated. Within these habitats, they're consuming a variety of food. So cranes are omnivores. They'll eat the grain left over in harvested fields. They'll eat wild berries, tubers, acorns, native vegetation. They will also be eating the invertebrates and mollusks and small mammals, reptiles as well. I like to say that they will eat pretty much anything that fits in their beaks, including small birds. And kind of like the habitat use, diet will depend a lot on just what's available within the landscape. Their diets do change based on biological need though, so they'll forage in areas and select higher carb items in throughout the winter, and then start switching more to higher protein items in late winter and in springtime, as well as selecting for more calcium-rich foods at that point as well. So that can help with egg development. Currently, so within California, both populations are doing well. Like, they are believed to be stable, and so that's a good indication that the basic needs of these populations are being met. However, both populations are still below population goals, so we're still hoping to find ways to get the population to grow. So that could mean issues with not enough habitat. It could be limited roost habitat, or within the abundant cropland, maybe they're not able to find enough food. So trying to, as we move forward, just trying to key in on what's going on is going to be really important. So cranes, as well as all the other migratory water birds, pretty much anywhere, are facing a lot of threats. Within the Pacific Flyway, where drought has been a huge topic, it's really important to think about how the drought's been impacting the birds. So definitely drought's been a really big threat over the last few years, as well as too much flooding. Human population growth and the development we've been seeing in recent years. Development always is kind of a continuous threat, but I feel like in recent years, we've been seeing really big expansion around urban areas, and a lot of that's been at the expense of compatible cropland. So especially down here around Sacramento, we've been seeing lots and lots of acreage of rice going fallow and then getting developed. So it's hard to do anything about that, but when we're thinking about where we want to do conservation and protect lands, maybe not directly next to metropolitan areas where if you protect a wetland there, it could just end up being surrounded by development in a few years and probably become unsuitable. Other issues that they're facing is just changes in agriculture. Crops will be highly lucrative one year, and then too many people try to grow it, and then prices drop and you need to change crops. So it's been an interesting trend seeing lots of nut crops going in. And because nuts, cranes don't do well with trees. They can get stuck in trees. And so it's having too many orchards on the landscape is definitely a concern. And with rice being less lucrative than nut crops, it is definitely a continuous trend, seeing these compatible uses being switched to incompatible crops. At a kind of larger scale, climate change is definitely a concern, increasing drought and flooding. But then also sea level rise is an issue in areas where natural emergent wetlands, if they're still tidally influenced, sea level rise can definitely lead to loss of those wetlands. Here in the Delta, we're a very interesting landscape where a lot of the islands are below sea level. So in that map on this slide, all of the blue is about 15 to 20 feet below sea level. And so here, especially with flooding happening, we definitely need to think about long-term planning within these highly subsided areas and try to find ways of addressing that issue. If the island were to flood today, it would be 20 feet of water and we would lose all suitability for most of the water birds. And most of the Delta is the same. So definitely a concern for long-term sustainability. So as we're thinking about these threats, there's definitely some needs that come up to the top of my mind. In order to properly manage the populations that we have, getting an accurate count of how many cranes are here is really important. Because we've got two different populations that kind of migrate through and breed in an area that another one winters, and they're intermixed and they'll be with each other throughout most of the year. It's really hard to get a good count on what these birds are doing, whether the populations are actually stable or whether they're slightly increasing or potentially slightly decreasing. So getting better counts is pretty essential on management moving forward. Also trying to figure out why we haven't seen a big increase is just trying to key into food availability on the landscape. We may be assuming that corn is really good, but maybe a lot of farmers are switching to silage and there's very little grain left in silage fields. So there's definitely some nuances in food availability that haven't been accounted for. And especially in cropland, where practices change really quickly, food availability studies are probably drastically behind on what's actually available in these fields. More broadly thinking about conservation, definitely there's a big push to start protecting roost and foraging habitat everywhere. So also thinking about connectivity between breeding grounds and wintering grounds and the areas in between. So up in Northern California, the Klamath National Wildlife Refuge has been dry. And I've been hearing a lot of discussions about like how multiple years of dry habitat up there is going to affect these populations that migrate through and rely on that either for breeding or essential stopover habitat. Losing an essential area like that for too many years in a row could drastically change migration or kind of chronology within a flyaway. Other areas that we should definitely be focusing on is thinking about ways of reducing human and wildlife conflicts. And so that's where a lot of my research comes in, is looking at ways to improve crop management for wildlife, and then also thinking about multi-species management. Yeah. So here on Staten, Staten was purchased by the Nature Conservancy in 2001 because it's a historically important area for Sandhill Cranes. So we are located right in the heart of the Delta. And it's an area, even before TNC owned the island, it was managed for wildlife. It was predominantly a corn production. And so it's a 9,000 acre working farm. And just the nature of having so much corn on the island, we attract a lot of these upland foragers. So we've always had a lot of Sandhill cranes and Aleutian cackling geese, as well as other migratory birds. As a working farm, we've got a few different goals that we are trying to achieve. One is remaining an economically viable agricultural operation. So we want to make sure that whatever we are modeling could be implemented by other farmers. And so our other goal is remaining a functional ecosystem. So trying to remain suitable for migratory birds and meeting those habitat objectives, and trying to find ways to make those two very important goals compatible. More recently, as we start incorporating kind of long-term visioning for the island, we've been trying to find ways to address subsidence on the island. So out here in the Delta, we've got highly organic soils that when they are left dry, they oxidize and the soil just disappears. And so continuing to grow corn that requires the ground to be dry is unsustainable thinking about long-term, because as the island continues to subside, more pressure is put on the levees around us, and the likelihood of a catastrophic levee failure escalates. It becomes a lot more likely. So in recent years, there's been a huge push within the Delta because it's a really prevalent problem throughout these Delta islands and the push is towards subsidence friendly agriculture. So rice is a fantastic crop that will reverse subsidence and then also meets all those habitat goals, as well as it is very economically viable. Wetlands are another option, and we are definitely exploring some wetland restoration at this point. So I've kind of given a little bit of overview of the island, and when I talk about wildlife management on the island, we're talking about looking at or thinking about the different crops that we're growing. So corn versus tomatoes, and then the different benefits that those provide. We also rotate our crops, which can help increase crop yields. I also look at post-harvest management. So once we go through and harvest a cornfield, do we disc it immediately, or do we do some other operation that would provide benefit through the winter for birds? A lot of what I do is also flood management. So corn is not typically flooded in the wintertime, but it's one of those management practices that we implement that is low cost, but it provides a lot of benefit to wildlife and also provides benefit to the cropping. It helps leach salts out of fields. So it's kind of a win-win and is a great practice that we've been able to demonstrate out here. So on Staten, we've got a variety of different crops. Corn is definitely one that I've talked a lot about and provides waste grain. It can be flooded. It allows subsidence to continue though, so maybe not the best long-term moving forward. Triticale is a type of wheat, and wheat can be highly beneficial within these landscapes. It's harvested earlier than corn, so when we're thinking about selecting these different crops, we try to grow ones that are harvested at different times and can allow for early flood up in July while other fields are still growing. So triticale is definitely one of those early harvested crops. And it actually grows all winter. So we rotate it around the landscape. And so one field may be freshly planted triticale, while another one is harvested and flooded immediately in fall. So we're getting this rotation of different crop types around the island. Triticale, while it's growing, is fantastic forage. This big picture in the background is a triticale field with a lot of aleutians on it. And so midwinter, it's something fantastically fresh, growing green sprouts that the geese can forage down. There's also opportunities for invertebrate and tuber foraging for cranes. In the summertime, triticale is also a great breeding habitat for nesting grassland species. So we get a lot of red-winged blackbirds that nest on Staten in the triticale. Another crop that we have is alfalfa, and well, it can't be flooded. It is great upland foraging and is also essential habitat to Swainson's hawks. So we're also trying to meet the needs of the various raptors, and we've got a huge diversity of raptors down here that we also need to consider when we're making management decisions. Potatoes are another common one. No leftover grain in the fields, but it is floodable, provides great mudflat habitat. It's also more of a cash crop, so corn doesn't return a lot, so it isn't really meeting our economic needs, but potatoes, alfalfa, rice, those are some higher yielding or high revenue crops for us that kind of make up for deficits when we grow corn or triticale or fallow areas for wetlands. Rice, it's a great crop, stops subsidence, provides leftover grain, easily flooded. There's a lot of benefits to rice, which is one of the reasons why it has had a lot of success in kind of relabeling itself as a very ecologically friendly crop. So it really does have a lot of benefits for water birds. So in addition to kind of just visually going through all of this, we pair all of our crop decisions with some research. And so we go through and monitor the actual response of the different birds on the island to these different management practices. So every winter we go through, we monitor crane and large water bird foraging. We do weekly roost counts to see what habitat roosting cranes are using on the island and track seasonal trends on the island. So here I've got a graph of our data over the last, since about 2013 is when we started doing these weekly or monthly counts. And over the time, we've been able to build these graphs showing kind of the average within different periods. In recent years, we've definitely been seeing an increase in fall use on Staten. So that could mean maybe birds are just slightly changing their migratory strategies. A lot of that could do with local weather. Maybe they got pushed farther south or are just staying a little bit longer. In order to really key into some of those trends, we would also need to do more surveys regionally. And we do coordinate these roost counts with monthly counts throughout the Sandhill Crane wintering area. And these counts happen on all of the public lands and includes participating private lands. And one of the goals for coming years is to really expand that and try to get as many landowners to participate as possible. The more participants we have, the better coverage we have, and the better we can estimate populations. So it would be pretty beneficial to do more outreach and increase participation. In addition to all the water bird monitoring, we also do research into cropping systems, so looking at cover crops or small grain trials on the island. We test out different farming equipment for like fine scaled nitrogen use trials, and just trying to find ways to improve farm management in here in the Delta. We also do research into subsidence and greenhouse gas productions within different crops, and then also definitely tracking water quality. And so as I'm thinking about conservation of these birds, Sandhill is a great area where we're trying to test out different cropping practices and really try to find ways of minimizing that human wildlife conflict. And more regionally, there's been a huge push for incentive programs within working lands. So trying to find ways of filling habitat gaps throughout the year. And luckily with the drought, there's been a huge push on getting funding into these programs and trying to get as much habitat on the ground. This last fall, typically we've got about 500,000 acres of rice within the Sacramento Valley, and this last year it was down to about 300,000. So when we're thinking about impacts on all water birds, that's a massive loss. And so a lot of these different agencies, whether it's California Waterfowl Association, CDFW, TNC, we're all trying to come together and find ways of getting as much wetlands and habitat out on private lands as possible. Refuges are extremely important, but realistically, it's hard to expand refuges too much. Maintaining that functionality on these private lands is just really essential in long-term conservation goals. And that is the end of my slides. I would love, let me stop sharing my screen, and I would love to answer questions.
Do you have your chat screen open?
There we go. I got it open. Okay, let me put this. What time of year is the migration through the Midwest? I've got experience with the mid-continent flyway. I did my research down in Texas, and for migration, I'm trying to think of the best time period. Late September may be a great time, or in mid-September. As far as seeing them migrate through, there's the Crane Trust along the Platte River that you could look up, and I know that they've got tours right at peak migratory periods, so you could check there as far as when would be the best time to visit. eBird could also be a really good tool as far as actually pinning down when birds are coming through an area. I don't have specific dates.
Right. No, yeah, that's what. Yeah, I was just curious. That Platte River is the biggest. I think that's the biggest one that people can go.
Yeah.
See.
Okay. Then photo looks like foraging with blackbirds and grackles.
Yeah, one of the photos he had was back at the beginning. There was one of the photos in it. That one right there, on the top left. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's mostly. I'm trying to remember where this picture came from. may be one of my pictures from Texas, so they could be grackles.
Right.
I think it is from Texas.
Okay.
Good call. We do get, in recent years, we've been getting these really large flocks of yellow-headed blackbirds down in the Delta, which kind of a tangent, but it's been really cool to see large flocks down here. Unfortunately, we've also been getting more grackles. So cranes are not hunted in California. That is correct. California is, the Pacific Flyway is one of the least hunted flyways. Like there is limited hunting up in Alaska of the lesser sandhill crane. Within California, the Central Valley population of graders is state threatened. So there's no hunting of that population. The lessers, sorry, graders, Central Valley graders. I don't know if I said that. But the lessers coming down from Alaska do get hunted.
But not in California.
Correct, yeah. So there's less rice being grown now in California than previously. Yes. And some of that could just be temporary trends, but a lot of projections are not showing that it's supposed to increase from here. I think California is pretty much at its maximum around 500,000 acres. We just really don't have enough water to sustain more than that for maybe 1 or 2 years in a row. And once a lot of growers are converted to rice, too much being produced will make the prices crash, and then more and more will just come out of rice. Every time I drive down I-5, I see more tree crops. Yes, I'm pretty devastated. Right off of our island, about 1,000 acres got turned to orchards, and it'll be really interesting to see what our monitoring shows over the next few years as far as use on the island. Thinking about the landscape scale and what's surrounding a wetland unit where roosting is common, it's really important as far as trying to meet the needs. So typically, if I know my nearby landowners are going to flood a lot, I may flood less on my island so I can meet the foraging needs of birds. And kind of vice versa. In drought years, I try to flood up more in general, since I know there'll be less wetlands across the landscape. But as trees come in around the island, I may just try to maintain a more constant ratio of roost to foraging, because I know they're not going to be able to leave the island to forage or roost. I'll try to just manage for a smaller population.
Yeah, so when I drive down I-5, I mean, for the last probably year, where there was either just fallow ground or some kind of crops, ground crops, it's just all trees. They all the way down the corridor, it's just trees.
Yeah. Yeah, California, I saw a statistic recently that California produces more than 95% of the world's almonds, walnuts,
yeah.
pistachios, and I think one other nut. So we are like the place for nut trees, and most of those are within the Central Valley.
And I was under the impression that those nuts take more water than rice or any of those other crops. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. It's hard to. It may be based on how you measure it. Like a lot of rice water just gets returned to the system versus actually being consumed by the trees. I believe that they definitely use more than, let's say, corn compared to rice. I can't say. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I know it's a significant amount. Okay, are you anticipating significant flooding this year? Yes, maybe. Within the last year, we've had, I think there was a 5% chance of historic flooding, but then also like a 5% chance of historic droughts. And within 1 year, we had one of the worst droughts we've had in decades and also one of the worst floods. So statistically, we just had both happen. So moving forward, there's definitely questions on how land managers are supposed to manage in the face of complete uncertainty as far as weather. So typically we try to manage with the idea that like maybe a drought will happen for 1 year and then after that it'll get better, but what do we do now? So I'm not sure about next year. I hope we get rain, but I hope we don't get torrential downpours like this year.
We've all been watching the kind of accumulating catastrophe of Tulare Lake.
Yeah.
Which at the very least is taking out a huge amount of land and will last 2 years, 3 years, some length of time. Is that something you need to plan for?
I think it's important that the farmers consider that. I know it's easy to forget that it was a lake basin when it's been dry for so long, but I think policy should kind of help farmers make that decision to not put orchards in a lake basin. Like it seems kind of like common sense to me, but at the same time, there's a lot of pressure to produce. So
Yeah.
I think as far as resiliency of a system, if we can make sure that areas that are part of the floodplain are in that, like corn, if you lose it, it's not going to be a devastating blow to a farmer's crop, like long-term viability. So they would be able to turn around and plant the next day, and like they would take a hit for a year, but it wouldn't be like losing an orchard. So I don't know if that fully answered, but that's what I would think about as far as long-term planning. Is this main cackling goose nesting area? We don't get nesting cacklers. They breed up on the Aleutian Islands, but we're definitely a big wintering area, so we get up to like 80,000 Aleutians at one time in the wintertime, which is crazy because they're a fantastic example of what management of a population can do, because they were endangered and they have completely recovered. Their population's doing fantastic. And the main management activity that allowed for that was removal of non-native foxes from the breeding grounds that were decimating the colonies. So it's a great example of conservation success.
You said removal of what? Foxes?
Mm-hmm. Arctic foxes got introduced to their breeding areas, and we're just decimating the nests.
But by the Russians, I think. Okay. In the 1800s is when those foxes were introduced to fur breeding.
Okay. Then is there a large number of tricolored blackbirds nesting there? We have not had any tricolored colonies on Staten yet, but prior to triticale harvest, I will go out and survey for blackbirds. So we're definitely aware. We are within the breeding area, so it's kind of just a matter of time before our farmers hope they don't have any, but I hope to see some, and I would love to have one. I am obviously the conservation side of our operation. But yeah, they breed near us, so it's a possibility. How are roosting abundance counts conducted? Are they flyovers? Roosting counts occur either first thing in the morning, where we count birds as they're waking up and then flying off the roost, or here in the Delta, we've got really, really thick tule fog. So on foggy mornings, we'll switch our count to the evenings and watch them come in. There's, with more and more rice and wetlands coming into the Delta, I think that's having an influence on fog production. And the last few years, we've had like 2 or 3 days where the fog just never clears. And I hear that's what it historically used to be like. So it's interesting seeing kind of fog over the last few years. Are you able to share these strategies with other Delta farmers, and is there openness to using your findings? Yes and no. We try to communicate as much with farmers as possible. We hold grower meetings where, especially recently with rice coming in, rice is still really new in the Delta, and a lot of people think that you can't actually grow it and that it's not going to be profitable down here. But I think we've been able to show that it is definitely profitable in the Delta. And as part of that, we've been working with UCANR and the Agricultural Extension System to talk to rice growers, talk about what we're doing, and then also during those meetings, talk about wildlife friendly management practices. So really just trying to show like slight tweaks that you can use to help make it more wildlife friendly. It is definitely the land of the fruit and nuts.
Right. So yeah. So Chet chimed in with cackling goose devastated by Arctic foxes.
Yeah.
Great presentation. Does anybody have any other questions? If not, I am going to stop recording.
Emily, that was